Our next speaker this morning is Jen Pierce. Jen teaches quaternary geomorphology, Holocene fire history, and climate change, recent fire history and climate change, feedbacks among hydrologic, biologic, and geologic systems at Boise State University. Please welcome Jen Pierce.
Thanks very much, Devin. I'd really like to thank the organizers of this conference, particularly Devin and Megan, for bringing us all together in this room to talk about fire in the West. I'd also like to acknowledge my co-authors listed up here. What I'll be presenting to you today is a combination of 10 different studies, so this talk really would not have been possible without them. To quote the talking heads, how did we get here? You know, this is not my beautiful house. This is not my beautiful wife. This is not my beautiful fire regime. You know, what's going on here? So as all of you in this room certainly know, landscapes throughout the West have experienced large standard-placing fires. Every summer, we brace ourselves for yet another severe fire season. And that's the case whether we live in the high elevation lodgepole pine forests, middle elevation ponderosa, Doug fir forests, or our sagebrush steppes. So fires throughout a range of these ecosystems. Why is this happening? Well, I don't think that we can ignore the elephant in the room, which is climate. I always joke with people that I went to school for 12 years to tell you that there's larger, more severe fires when it's warm and dry, right? So there you go. I think I'm done with my talk, right? So July was the hottest month on record. Our spring snow cover throughout the West is declining. Fall temperatures are going up, so the length of our fire season is getting longer on both ends. You know, our snows are melting off our landscapes earlier in the spring, and it's remaining warmer into the fall. In addition, our temperatures, our precipitation, let's see if this pointer works, certainly here in this neck of the woods, is also decreased during the fall and for large areas of the United States here. Those trends have been accompanied by an increase in large, severe fires. Since 1975, work from Matt Jolly and his colleagues published in Nature showed that there has been a 25% increase in the length of the fire season globally. This corresponds with over doubling of the burnable area globally. So some pretty somber results here. So this applies not only to the West, but worldwide increase in fire activity. How extraordinary, though, are these fires in the past? I mean, are these large, standard-placing fires truly extraordinary when we look at a longer record? So that's what I'll be doing here today. Secondarily, are these large fires fueled by prior fire suppression and management versus climate? We'll talk about that a little bit. How can these past records inform future management? Just before my talk today, I was looking around the room and thinking, gosh, you know, trying to understand these past climate records, while I think it's hard, I think that for many of you in this room, your job is harder. For Mike Pellant, for the other land managers in this room, you've got a really tough job in terms of trying to figure out what do we do. So I'm not going to answer those questions for you, but at least maybe I can provide a backdrop. And finally, are we facing a future type transition from forest to shrubland? And again, that's nothing that I'll be able to address definitively, but perhaps these past records can help. What I'll be showing you today is records of fire over a long time period. And when I'm talking about long time periods, I'm talking about thousands of years. And I'd really like to thank Rick for setting the stage in terms of talking about fire and vegetation trends over thousands of years. So that's what I'll be looking at. In particular, I'll be looking at how climate and changes in climate over millennial timescales change patterns of vegetation, that vegetation type and density influences fire regimes, And in particular, in terms of the Sherlock Holmes, so what kind of clues am I going to be using to look at fire? My colleagues and I look at the geomorphic response to fire, and what I mean by that is the erosional response to fire, and looking at fire-related erosion and deposition. I heard at one point that, to give a good talk, you should only give your audience 3 things to really as take-home messages. So instead, I'm going to give you 7. But I know you're smart, and it's early in the morning. But in case you kind of space out later in the talk, these are my main take-home points. First, our ponderosa pine and Doug fir forests can burn at both ends of the spectrum, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that means in a second. Second, the post-fire erosional response changes with both temporal changes in climate and with spatial changes in climate. So our ecosystem type actually changes the type of erosional response we see to fire. Third, in the Northern Rockies in particular, and again, I thank Rick for already introducing this topic, the late arrival of many of our pine species corresponds with an increase in fire activity. Fourth, fire and sage steppe used to be fuel limited, but human influence and invasive species, I think, particularly have influenced this ecosystem type. Fifth, moist, high elevation lodgepole pine and mixed conifer forests typically burn in infrequent but standard placing fires, so this isn't new news to most of you. And when I show my combined records from our Northern Rockies and southwestern sites, you can see that the past records of fire are in some cases coherent, but not necessarily synchronous. However, 8 of the 10 study areas have burned since about the mid-1980s that I'll be looking at. So we certainly see synchronicity in recent times. Okay, so where are these areas? As I'm stepping through my study area sites, I'd like you to note here what we're showing in these little climate graphs, again, similar to the previous talk, are the patterns of precipitation and temperatures. So here, for example, in the South Fork Payette, you can see a strongly xeric precipitation regime, very summer dry, as opposed to our monsoonally dominated southwestern sites. So these do span quite a range of climates. So the areas I'll be talking about today, Yellowstone, our moistest, coolest site, Grant Meyer's work. The Middle Fork of the Salmon River, Carrie Riley's work here at Utah State. And the Middle Fork was so big that we actually split it into 2 different study areas, the upper and lower. The upper site is lodgepole pine mixed conifer, similar to the sawtooths, Lars Svensson's thesis work, whereas the lower Middle Fork is more xeric, sagebrush steppe. The South Fork of the Payette, right over here, this is my work with Grant Meyer, ponderosa pine mixed Douglas fir forests. The Boise front, so this is the Boise area and then a little bit east into the Danskin Mountains. Ongoing work by Mike Pullis and prior work by Nathan Nelson. The City of Rocks, closest to your neck of the woods here, so this is work by Carrie Wepner and Julio Betancourt and myself. The San Juan Mountains, Erica Biagio, Tom Swetnam and others. The Jemez, Aaron Fitch and Grant Meyer's work, down again, both of these ponderosa pine, mixed Douglas fir. The Kendrick Mountains in Arizona, Sarah Jenkins' work, also ponderosa pine dominated. And finally, the Sacramento Mountains down in southern New Mexico, also ponderosa pine, Doug fir dominated forests. As you can see from that map and depicted pictorially here, these study areas span a wide range of precipitation, temperature, and forest types, from our cool, wet, hard-to-burn lodgepole pine forests in Yellowstone and the upper Middle Fork Basin into, again, the more xeric, South Fork Payette, ponderosa pine-dominated forests. A few sites, again, from the margins of our sagebrush steppe and lower elevation tree line. the currently pinyon pine juniper forests of City of Rocks, and then into the predominantly ponderosa and Doug fir forests of the Southwest. These forests span a wide range in fire return intervals as well, from our generally much shorter fire return intervals for our ponderosa forests to much longer fire return intervals for both our lodgepole pine and for our, used to be, for our basin and range sites. So what are we doing? How do we obtain these long records of fire? What we do is we radiocarbon date charcoal from alluvial deposits, and we describe the nature of the stratigraphy at those sites. So this shows a picture from Carrie Riley's work in the Middle Fork of the Salmon, showing a sequence of fire-related deposits. So here's a fire-related debris flow dated at 200 calibrated years before present, followed by some sheet floods. And I'll talk more about this different erosional response to fire, again, the difference between these debris flows and sheet floods. Large fire-related debris flow about 2,850 calibrated years before present, and so on. So this study combines over 400 radiocarbon dates from hundreds of stratigraphic sections throughout the Northern Rockies and the Southwest. We then compare these fire records, independent records of vegetation and climate change, reconstructed from pollen records. For example, Kathy Whitlock's work here in Decker Lake in the Sawtooth. This is Julio Betancourt's son actually climbing up for a pack rat midden in the City of Rocks, and a picture of some of our macrofossils collected from those deposits. All right, so here in one giant mess of spaghetti squiggly lines is the combined fire record. So for those of you in the audience who really like looking at squiggly lines and paleoclimatic records, you're going to be a little bit disappointed because we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about that. So the rest of you can breathe a sigh of relief here. But what you can see is, or maybe not see because it's too small, is these records go back about 11,000 years, going from our southernmost site in the Sacramento Mountains up to Yellowstone. One thing I want to point out is that you see a general, what looks like a general decrease in fire activity over time. This is due in large part to the fading record, that those older deposits are much less likely to be preserved, and it's harder for us to dig and obtain those pieces of charcoal. But within this, you certainly can also see times of regionally coherent peaks within these records, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Okay, so first point, that ponderosa pine and Doug fir forests burn at both ends of the spectrum. So what do I mean by that? Well, I think this is pretty well illustrated from my work from the South Fork of the Payette. So what these two graphs show, shown here in blue, is a record of small inferred low severity fires from the South Fork of the Payette, where you see some large peaks, the most prominent one here during the Little Ice Age about 500 years ago. So as shown by these records and from many, many wonderful dendro fire records, surface fires were certainly very prevalent in southwestern and northern Rockies ponderosa pine and Douglas fir forests. So that had been the kind of standard fire regime accepted for these forest types. However, what we find when we look at a longer record is that even before any effective prior management, so now in this lower graph here, 1,000 years ago during the medieval climatic anomaly, we also see records of large stand replacing fires in these ponderosa pine forests. This is supported by all of the records from the ponderosa pine and Douglas fir forest, both those in the northern Rockies and in the southwestern sites, where when you look back over thousands of years, all these different records have shown evidence of large stand replacing fires in ponderosa pine and Doug fir forests long before effective human management of these systems. Those fires occurred typically during times of prolonged drought. So again, our ponderosa pine, Douglas fir forests burn both during frequent low-severity fires and infrequently during standard placing fires. This is a photo of some of these large fire-related debris flows from Sarah Jenkins' work. And then some of these more frequent sheet flooding events in the Bandelier area from Aaron Fitch's work. So you should be asking yourself at this point, well, how the heck do you know anything about fire regimes and whether a fire was severe or not by looking at these little pieces of charcoal? Well, the way that we can infer that is by looking at the post-fire erosional response. So again, taking a close look at those stratigraphic sequences and the type of erosion that results from these fires. So the results from these stratigraphic studies show that debris flows are typically more characteristic of burned previously forested areas, whereas sheet flooding events are more characteristic of more open forests or sagebrush steppe dominated landscapes. So to look at these in the stratigraphy here, here again from Carrie Riley's work in the Middle Fork of the Salmon, you can see a higher elevation lodgepole pine dominated site, which is dominated by these thick, less frequent debris flows. So debris flow 8,900 calibrated years before present, large debris flow about 2,700 years before present. This contrasts with her lower elevation sagebrush steppe open forest sites, both in her area and then again throughout all of these study areas, which show that these rangeland sites are both a combination of sheet flooding events and debris flows. So that's the key here. So what can those tell us again then about our fire severity? Well, what's shown in this cartoon, either wet climates back in time or in wet climates spatially today, though that increased vegetation density increases overall slope stability, increases soil development, and you have increased storage of colluvial sediment on these hill slopes. However, following fire on these steep, previously forested hill slopes, you have a large release of sediment, and that comes in the form of a debris flow and is then preserved as a debris flow in the stratigraphic record. Conversely, in drier areas, that decreased vegetation density leads to increased sheet flooding, both during fires and not. So you get increased more sloughing of sediment off these hill slopes, both during fires and during storm events. We have decreased soil development and decreased storage on those slopes. So then what is preserved in the stratigraphic record following fire are more frequent but less thick sheet flood deposits. Okay, so second point. Moving on to the third point again, and Rick talked about this as well. In the northern Rockies, the late arrival of our pine species, so ponderosa pine, lodgepole pine, and pinyon pine on these landscapes, corresponds with an increase in fire activity. I'll step through a few of these records here. Starting at the top, this is the City of Rocks record, showing from pack rat middens the arrival and expansion of Utah juniper and single-leaf pinyon on these landscapes. Single-leaf pinyon only arrived at City of Rocks about 2,800 years ago, and then really only expanded about 700 years ago. So for those of you who have been to City of Rocks, hopefully you all have because it's a beautiful area, the pinyon, when you get up on that landscape, we think of these tree species as having been there forever. They haven't. Pinyon really is a real late arrival to that system. That expansion of pinyon does correspond with a dramatic increase in fire in that ecosystem. Now stepping down to the Middle Fork of the Salmon, Carrie Riley's work, Kathy Whitlock's pollen records from Decker Lake show that lodgepole pine arrived and really only expanded about 2,800 years ago. From Carrie's records of fire in the Middle Fork Salmon, this also corresponds with an increase in fire in that system. Finally, down in the South Fork Payette, from my work, Ponderosa pine, I don't find any ponderosa pine macrofossils older than 4,000 years ago. So again, ponderosa pine is likely a relative newcomer in that system. You kind of get into a chicken and egg situation here, which came first, the fires or the pines? And I can't answer that. Of course, the resolution of these charcoal pieces, we can't resolve fires to, plus or minus 50 years at best, right? So we can't really answer that question, but I can say that they go hand in hand. Especially, and if you imagine these lodgepole pine systems, those are extremely both fire prone and fire adapted. So if you think of a Yellowstone National Park or a Sawtooths without lodgepole pine, and think about how different those fire regimes might have been back then, this makes sense that the arrival of these pines on our landscape would correspond with an increase in fire activity. So that's the vegetation story there. In addition, to tie those 2 points together, at the City of Rocks, the arrival of those pinyon pines corresponds with both an increase in fire, but also an increase in the arrival of debris flows in that system. The City of Rocks hadn't generally been typified by debris flows prior to the arrival of pinyon pines and potentially then stand replacing severe fires on those landscapes. Okay, to the fourth point, fire in sage steppe had, from our limited records, we have just about two study areas that are in the sage steppe ecosystem, had been more fuel limited, and by that I mean that that fire had been limited by the expanse and continuity of fuels in the past. I would say, and I'm sure all of you in this room would agree, that certainly is not the case now with the arrival and expansion of invasive species such as cheatgrass, and I'm hoping that Mike Pellant will talk a lot more about this in the next talk. To show you a few of those records, though, this is Nathan Nelson's work from the Danskin Mountains, just to the east of Boise. What he found in his record, so this is his fire record here on the bottom, and this is a record of the Palmer Drought Severity Index. There is a peak in fire here in the Danskins during certainly a dry time period here, but our largest peak in fire in his ecosystem, this is about 600, 500 years ago, comes during a time of variable climates during the beginning of the Little Ice Age. We infer that this system burns during times of drought still, but during times of drought that are bracketed by overall wetter intervals where you have the growth, which promotes the growth of fuels in those ecosystems. This is also shown by Mike Pullis's work from the Boise front. His record here is shown in blue, this little peak during a time where you don't see fires in most other ecosystems. In the Boise front, the largest peak in fire actually occurs with an overall wetter time period. This upper graph shows the drought area index reconstruction, again suggesting a fuel-limited system. This is certainly not the case now. This is, how about that? Now we've got multiple screens. Unfortunately, there's not one right in front of me, so I can't, see what I'm talking about there. But the soda fire, which just burned this summer on the Idaho-Oregon border, over 280,000 acres. My students and I installing some dust traps in this area. This was not a low-severity burn, right? This was a very high-severity, very large fire, and that is I would say, a step change, right in this ecosystem. Fifth point, our moist, high-elevation lodgepole pine and mixed conifer forests typically burn infrequently during times of drought. And again, this shouldn't be news to those of you in the audience. This is also borne out in the longer-term record. So records from Yellowstone, from the Salmon River, higher Middle Fork salmon, show a extreme interval of fire during what I would like to rename, actually, instead of the medieval climatic anomaly, I'd like to rename it the MVP, or the medieval variable period, because I think that's really the type of climate that typified this interval. Both intervals of very extreme prolonged drought and wetter intervals. So if you want to create the perfect storm for large fires, this is what you want, right? So multi-decadal wet intervals where you can grow your fuels, followed by multi-decadal droughts. And we certainly see in the longer term record evidence of fire throughout a range of ecosystems during this time. And certainly the Yellowstone sites. Conversely, even though we experienced low severity fires in some of our ponderosa pine Douglas fir forests during the Little Ice Age here, there is an absence of fire during the Little Ice Age in the higher elevation sites in Yellowstone. All right. Again, when we look at these past records, we do show regionally coherent, but not necessarily synchronous peaks in fire activity. So again, going back to my spaghetti graphs, this time just looking over the past 3,000 years, those of you who like to match curves can certainly see that there are times when many of these ecosystems did not show peaks in fire. For example, a peak in fire about 500 years ago for many of our ponderosa pine Douglas fir systems, but a low point in fire activity, again, for our high elevation lodgepole pine forests in Yellowstone. When we combine all of these records, we do see times of regional peaks in fire activity, again, about 200 years ago, 500 years ago, 900 years ago, and so on and so forth. So we do see times that appear to be more fiery in the past for different reasons. Okay, again, climatically, the medieval variable period was characterized by multi-decadal drought and fires in both our high elevation and our mixed Douglas fir ponderosa pine forests. Not so much from our records in our sagebrush steppe, right? This is not a time of particular fire activity in our sagebrush steppe from the limited records we have then. Here during the Little Ice Age, a time of relatively cooler and wetter climates than today, but certainly also typified by some droughts. For example, 1632 was a big drought year and big fire year in the Sawtooths from Lars Svensson's reconstructions. But from these records, and again, this is hard to say with the resolution of those radiocarbon dates, I do not see anything as widespread and synchronous as we do today. Now, again, I say that with the caveat that our understanding, of course, of our fire regime since 1985 and the extent and severity of those fires is much greater than our understanding of fire activity inferred from charcoal and deposits. But this certainly is a big shift from what the record shows as far as we can see. So again, to sum it up, here's a record. This is from central Idaho. Our ponderosa pine forests have burned frequently during less severe fires in the past, but also during standard placing fires. During recent times, our ponderosa pine Douglas fir forests have burned in some very large standard placing fires throughout the West. Those fires have produced, here's a person down here for scale, some very large fire-related debris flows. Here's a photo from the City of Rocks to remind you that these pinyon juniper forests that you see on our landscapes, as well as the lodgepole and ponderosa pine forests that you see in parts of the northern Rockies, really may not have been there for that long, so thousands to hundreds of years. Our sagebrush steppe environments, where in the past they may have been more fuel limited, are burning in fairly unprecedented fires, and again, I think Mike Pellant will talk more about this, and very severely. So I think this is an area where invasive species and potentially human management have played a large role. Our lodgepole pine forests and mixed conifer forests, again, burn typically during severe droughts, and they're doing so now, right? So Devin talked about the large fires in Yellowstone in '88, large fires in central Idaho starting in the mid-1980s. which has produced a giant red spots, certainly all over Idaho and throughout the western U.S. So in the remaining minutes, I'm just going to touch a little bit on what does that mean for us in terms of management. Are these recent fires really extraordinary, and are they a result of management or fire? So let's talk a little bit more about that. So first question, are these recent fires due to buildup of fuels, during what I'd like to call the Smokey Bear era, right? So starting in, about the mid, in 1950s, is that what has fueled our recent fires? I would argue no, that the fuel buildup started a long time ago during the Little Ice Age. So again, and the cooler, generally wetter conditions during the Little Ice Age led to growth and expansion of fuels throughout many of our landscapes. However, particularly in the last 100 years, so this is showing our fire peaks from my fire reconstructions, and we don't have any radiocarbon dates of fires in the last 100 years. Now there's two reasons for this. First of all, we don't want to, all of the researchers didn't want to waste a radiocarbon date by dating something that looked like it was really young. Okay, so this certainly could be a sampling bias. However, this fire deficit is also supported by, for example, Erica's work showing from her study that the tree ring record shows 20th century fires were unusually lacking. So again, this is from her records in southern Colorado. And this is supported by many, many other dendrochronological records. This fire deficit is also referenced in Jennifer Marlin's work, which is a really interesting paper, that again, going back over thousands of years, they look at the reconstructed fire frequency, reconstructed temperatures, and what they find is that there is a, what they again call this fire deficit, difference between what they expect to burn on our landscapes and what is actually burning. They attribute this to densification of woody species such as sagebrush and juniper, due potentially to widespread grazing in the late 1800s. So that they attribute this to grazing and management, but again, going back before our Smokey Bear era. Where are we today? This is the picture showing what I mentioned during the first slide, Matt Jolly and his colleagues' work, again showing an increase in fire weather seasons by over 25% on the Earth and over a doubling of our global burnable area. Okay, so this is a phenomenon that's not just affecting the West, but will continue to affect us here globally going forward. What does this mean in terms of potential type transition, again, from forests to shrublands? I'm frankly worried about our ponderosa pine forests. This is a map from Tony Westerling's work showing forest susceptibility to changes in fire season. And this is a map of our distribution of ponderosa pine. So I think especially at our lower elevation tree lines, following fire, we may not see those forests growing back. And that's going to be a very challenging and interesting question to address in the years going forward. So thank you very much for your attention, and hopefully we have time for some questions.
Questions for Jen?
I overwhelmed you with my 7 points.
Please help me understand how you detect in your charcoal record very high frequency fire regimes in the order of, the number isn't important, but somewhere around 10-year fire return intervals, low severity surface kinds of fires, either forest systems or perhaps grass dominated systems. How well do you feel you're able to detect that in charcoal record?
Well, certainly, the radiocarbon dating cannot resolve any sort of frequency in the order of 15, tens of years, decades. So we cannot determine high frequency on that level. What we can do, though, is, again, radiocarbon date those packages of those thinner sheet flood deposits, again, which geomorphically result from less severe, more frequent fires. So when you have a packet of dates, say 2,100, 2,000, 1,900, 1,800 packets of those sheet floods, then we infer a more frequent, less severe fire regime. But we certainly cannot resolve, decadal or annual sorts of timescales from those results. However, when you contrast those then with ecosystems such as Yellowstone, where you don't have any record of fire for thousands of years, and then you have a large erosional response, that's the difference between those. So we're not capturing by any means every fire on the landscape, but we are getting a measure of both those fires and the landscape response to those fires. So, good question. Mm-hmm. Hi.
Just a question on, from the Front Range, and we just recently just had a huge 1,000-year event. Flooding, September 2015. And how, it's one of the things in terms of climate change is not just shifts in the amount of precipitation, but particularly timing of precipitation events is a shift that is potentially expected in the future. How would one distinguish, just shifts in precipitation? None of that occurred on burned landscape at all, and yet, incredible flooding events, a lot of charcoal washed in.
That's a great question, Peter. Of course, this erosional response is a combination both of the fires and then the storm events. What Sue Cannon has shown from her great work on fires and erosion from the Colorado area is that following these particularly the severe fires, it doesn't take much. So even a 1 to 2 year return interval storm event can produce a very large erosional response from those burn basins. So going back in the past, what we're counting on is that those landscapes would have responded similarly, and that if you have a very severely burned area, that's going to produce a debris flow even during a run-of-the-mill type of storm. But what we also do see in the past, from Carrie's records, from my records, we do find evidence of large, thick flooding events sometimes that do not have charcoal, which are not attributed then to fire, and that is a storm event that is independent of fire. So yeah, good question. But I think that's in terms of our geomorphic response moving forward, it's going to be very interesting to see how those precipitation trends change. So yeah, great question.
Let's give Jen a big hand.